Now, with this question here, this is actually something that's pretty popular. And I learned this from you and David Wood, actually. So the question is, this is from Amir Ashafra. And let me be clear in saying I'm not asking this question to, make light of him or try to put him on the spot or anything like that, but it's a teaching opportunity. So he asked the question, he says, where in the Bible does Jesus say, I am God, worship me? Now, the way this is phrased, this is a very popular question that many Muslim apologists or just kind of like Muslims teach their followers or whatever to ask Christians. It's kind of like a stump you kind of a thing, and they teach them to frame it in this particular way. Now, I'm gonna let you take a stab at this, but one thing I want to say is that when people ask you a question or when they raise an objection to Christianity, you always want to be looking for the presuppositions. What does the question presuppose? What are the presuppositions that undergird the question? Now, the presupposition is that in order to have justification for referring to Jesus as God, you would have to have some text where he explicitly states it in the manner that is framed in this question. And if you can't provide something like that, then therefore you don't have justification for affirming that Jesus is God. Now, the reality is, going back to what Anthony was saying, is that there are various passages that we can refer to by which we can affirm that Jesus did indeed indicate that he was God. And some of them weren't necessarily a matter of him making some declarative statement to that effect, but it was in demonstrating through his actions. He had these different miracles that he did that affirmed, hey, you know what? He's pointing to the fact of his divinity. When it talks about like the water was stopped and so forth, the storm, was stopped and said, well, what manner of man is this who can cause the seas to pause and all this kind of stuff? As a matter of fact, I remember you were here last time. I think it was the book of Mark, where you walk through the various different miracles and actions of Jesus that a first century Jew, particularly knowing, what was revealed in the Old Testament, we're looking at like, oh man, these are red flags of divinity here. So again, Jesus, in terms of his earthly ministry, didn't declare anything about himself in terms of some sort of proclamation. He proclaimed himself through his actions, particularly the nature of the miracles that he did, which indicated his divinity. And then he also made references to, the Old Testament scriptures in terms of him being the Son of Man and so forth, that were also indicative of him being divine in the same sense that the Father is. So, but I want to throw this to you, Anthony. I'm sure you've run into this a lot. So like when you do, how do you come back at that?
Yeah. So first of all, just to give this a label, we like to call this the exact words criteria. Mm-hmm. Right. Unless God says it in exactly the way I tell him he has to say it, then he can't be, whatever he does tell us he is. And right. That's just fallacious, right? Once you break it down, what they're saying, that should surely expose it for what it really is. I mean, the very idea that we can tell God how he has to say something to us right. ought to strike us as indicating a fundamental problem in our approach to God. Right. We don't tell God how he has to say something. Rather, we look at what he does say and draw out the necessary implications and inferences. Otherwise, what we're doing is we're saying we're God, right? And only if he satisfies what we have on our own authority laid down for him, only when he jumps through our hoops will we then acknowledge him as God. And it reminds me of the philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein, who, he has this philosophy in his Tractatus Logico Philosophicus. He lays out this whole complicated, convoluted theory of language, where he says that basically all language is bogus and needs to be completely reworked. And then at the end of the treatise, he says, if you've understood me by this point, you realize, that you have to use my words like a ladder until you have climbed up beyond them and then kick away the ladder, right? So in other words, once you climb up this ladder, you then turn around and say this ladder is worthless. It doesn't even function like a ladder, right? It can't get me. You basically, right. But so
self-defeating, right?
Yeah, that's what this kind of approach is, right? It's saying I'm going to play God, tell you how you have to say it, and only after that will I acknowledge that you're God. Well, if he's only God on the basis of the passing your criteria, then he's not really God, is he? Right? We're called to bow down to what he says, not make him bow down to what we say. But now the other thing is, so now let's apply this question to the assumption of the questioner. The questioner assumes the Father is God, right? And he wants us to show that Jesus used this language. Well, let's turn the question back on the questioner, and I mean that respectively, but respectfully. But where does the Father in the gospel, since we're talking about Jesus in the gospels, where does the Father say, I am God, worship me? I can tell you of a certainty, you will never find it. There is no such statement. We do find Jesus telling people to worship the Father. We find the apostles telling people to worship the Father, right? But that's the same sort of thing that we find when it comes to Jesus, right? We find apostolic proclamations to this effect. We find prophetic statements to this effect. So if the questioner's assumption were valid, then it wouldn't only disprove that Jesus is God, it would disprove that the Father is God, because you never have the Father speaking that way. Ironically, you do have the Father saying about Jesus that he is God and that you're to worship him. Right? So surely if the assumption of the question is the Father is God without question, but not Jesus, so we need proof that Jesus is. So if that's the assumption, then if we can find the Father saying it, then that should be sufficient, right? So for example, in Hebrews 1 verse 8, the Father says about the Son, your throne, O God, is forever and ever. So the Father calls the Son God. In verse 6, just 2 verses prior to that, the Father says about the Son, let all the angels of God worship him. So here we have, in the space of 2 or 3 verses, the Father calling Jesus God, commanding the heavenly hosts to worship him. If the heavenly hosts, who are higher than us, are commanded to worship him, how much more are we required to worship him? And of course, we do find people worshiping him. Now, because Jesus in the Gospels identifies himself as the one who spoke to people in the Old Testament, right? We can go back to the Old Testament and see things that Jesus said about himself. As an example, we looked last time at John 8:58. Remember, throughout the context, Jesus is identifying himself as one who was known to and spoke face to face with Abraham. Right? The Jews are livid with Jesus because Jesus is saying they're not truly descendants of Abraham spiritually, because they're trying to kill him. But Abraham did not do this, right? Abraham did not try to kill him. Then Jesus, says several other things, which eventually leads the Jews to say, you're not yet 50 years old and you have seen Abraham. So they understand what he's saying.
They know exactly what it meant, right?
Yeah, and then Jesus said, I tell you the truth, before Abraham became, I am. He also said, Abraham rejoiced to see my day. He saw it and was glad. So there was a day that Abraham looked forward to seeing Christ. He saw it. Jesus says it in the past tense. Someday in the past when Abraham saw Jesus and rejoiced in seeing him. And so here, Jesus not only says that he saw Abraham, by the way, but he says he's eternal. Before Abraham became, I am. He contrasts the temporal becoming of Abraham with his eternal existence. So he identifies himself as the eternal one, the one who appeared to Abraham. When we look back to the life of Abraham and ask, when was it that Abraham saw the eternal one, the I am? And remember, the name I am is essentially where we get the name Jehovah from, or the phrase I am is where we get the name Jehovah. It's a noun form of that expression. And, we see God appearing to Abraham numerous times, especially in Genesis 18, right? So,
yeah, that's right.
So does the one who appears to Abraham and to the patriarchs and the prophets in the Old Testament say, I am God, worship me? Absolutely, over and over again, right? Since Jesus says, I'm that person, it doesn't take an especially rational person, who's, I guess, spent 8 years studying logic to understand the implications of this, right? And,
to your point, I mean, they knew exactly what it meant. The people that he was talking to knew what he meant, for sure.
Yeah, and that makes another point for us, and it ties in with what you're talking about. We have to remember God's what I refer to as the divine pedagogy, right? You know what a pedagogue is in the ancient world. A parent or parents would entrust their children to the care of a pedagogue. That was like a schoolmaster who would train their child, teach them subjects, teach them how to read, teach them other things. And so the pedagogue was somebody who was leading the child to maturity in his thinking, in his education, and that sort of thing. Well, Paul says that the Old Testament was a pedagogue. It was a schoolmaster to lead us to Christ. So God is doing all these things to prepare us for the coming of Jesus. And so when Jesus comes, Jesus tells us that we have to understand what he's saying and doing in light of all that had been said in the past. That wasn't said for no reason, right? It was said for a purpose, so that people would understand what Jesus was saying. So Jesus in John 5 says, you search the scriptures thinking that in them you have eternal life, but these scriptures testify about me, right?
Yeah,
Jesus also said, that you claim to believe in Moses, but Moses spoke about me. Jesus in Luke 24 led the apostles on the road to Emmaus through the Old Testament, the law, the Psalms, and the prophets, and showed them in the scriptures what they were saying concerning himself. And so once we realize that, and then look at the Old Testament and see what God was saying and doing, and then looking at Jesus, we see Jesus saying and doing exactly what God said and did in the Old Testament. And here's the misstep that a lot of people make. They look at the Old Testament and they see how Jesus is what's known as the antitype of the Old Testament prophets. So the prophets are types, right? Shadows or pictures of the coming Messiah. Jesus is the antitype, the fulfillment of those types. What they don't also see is how Jesus is also the equivalent in the New Testament of the Lord in the Old Testament.
Right.
So here's what I mean. So as an example, in the Old Testament at the Exodus, Moses was certainly involved, right? Moses was leading the people. Moses raised his staff. The waters parted. So there is something that Moses is doing. But at the same time, we know that over all of this, God is acting. God is the one who caused the wind to drive back the waters. God is the one who caused the waters to stand up in a heap and Israel to cross over on dry ground. God is the one, in the specific language the Old Testament uses in various Psalms. Psalm 104, 106, 107 says God rebuked the waters of the Red Sea and they parted, right? That's the same thing that Jesus comes and does in the New Testament. He's not just being portrayed as a Moses-like figure. He's also said to do the distinctive acts that God did in those events. Jesus rebuked the winds and the waves, and they were still. Jesus is the one who not only does what prophets do in the Old Testament, he also does, over and above what the prophets do, what God distinctively did in those acts. And so these are some of the ways that Jesus presents himself as God, but he also makes explicit statements, right? Jesus explicitly says, Mark 2:28, I am the Lord of the Sabbath, right? That's explicit language, the Lord of the Sabbath. Nobody could say that, but the Lord, right? God isn't the only word that designates deity. The Lord designates deity.
Absolutely.
And the Lord of the Sabbath is the Lord, right? He's Jehovah.
Absolutely.